Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, which lasted for 2 decades from 1955 to 1975, was one of the most brutal and shocking conflicts of the 20th century. On the shaped strip of land, 2 opposing governments emerged: the North, backed by the Soviet Union, China, and other socialist countries, and the South, supported by the United States and its allies, in an effort to stop the spread of communism under the domino theory. Amid the global tensions of the Cold War, Vietnam became the focal point of an ideological confrontation between 2 superpowers, a battlefield where political calculations and clashing ideals collided in flames. The war dragged on for 20 years, claiming millions of lives and leaving wounds that scarred not only this nation, but the collective memory of humanity. The roots of the conflict lay in the Vietnamese people's burning desire for independence after decades of colonial rule. In 1954, the victory at Dien Bien Phu stunned the world and forced France to sign the Geneva Accords, temporarily dividing the country at the 17th parallel. From that moment, the 2 halves of Vietnam embarked on divergent paths. The North sought national reunification under socialism, while the South, with American support, attempted to build an anti-communist regime. This division was like a blade driven through the nation's heart, a historical wound that every Vietnamese had to bear. By the early 1960s, the war escalated rapidly. The United States deployed massive numbers of troops to the South, accompanied by large-scale bombing campaigns over the North. The sound of helicopter blades, artillery fire, and air raid sirens echoed through towns and villages. Meanwhile, the National Liberation Front and North Vietnamese forces employed guerrilla tactics, hiding among the people, striking swiftly and disappearing, leaving U.S. and South Vietnamese forces mired in stalemate. In 1968, the Tet Offensive erupted, one of the most shocking events of the entire war. Though costly for the North, the surprise attack stunned the American public and shattered faith in the prospect of victory. From that point, the U.S. adopted the policy of Vietnamization, gradually transferring responsibility to the South Vietnamese army and withdrawing its own troops. But the war had gone too far to be easily stopped. Thousands of bombs continued to fall on Hanoi and Haiphong, while fierce battles raged across the South. Finally, on the 30th of April 1975, tanks of the Liberation Army rolled into the presidential palace. The victory flag flew over Saigon, marking the reunification of the country after 20 years of division. That image became a symbol both of national pride and of closure to one of the most tragic chapters of the 20th century. The consequences of the war were immeasurable. More than 3 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians alike lost their lives. Vast regions were devastated, farmlands ruined, homes reduced to rubble. Bombs, mines, and chemical agents, especially Agent Orange, left enduring scars on people and the environment, lasting for generations. On the American side, over 58,000 soldiers were killed, and hundreds of thousands more suffered injuries or psychological trauma. The war plunged the United States into a profound crisis of confidence, a fracture not only in politics, but in the national psyche. The war's impact extended far beyond Vietnam's borders. For the Vietnamese, the 30th of April 1975 marked the turning point of modern history. The country was unified but faced immense challenges of reconstruction amid economic collapse. For the United States, it was a bitter lesson about the limits of military power and the need for transparency in governance. In response, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, restricting the president's authority to deploy troops abroad. Meanwhile, the anti-war movement transformed American attitudes toward conflict, no longer seen as glorious, but as a haunting scar. The Vietnam War also ushered in a new era of media and culture. It was the first war broadcast on television, as footage and reports from the front lines appeared directly in Americans' living rooms. For the first time, the public saw the real face of war villages engulfed in flames, children fleeing napalm, weary soldiers in the jungle. Music became a voice of protest. "What are you fighting for? Bring him home," and "Times, give peace a chance," echoed across America, capturing a generation's longing for peace. Technologically, the Vietnam War was a turning point. The UH-1 Huey helicopter became a battlefield icon, introducing the concept of air mobility that revolutionized troop transport and logistics. Advances in electronics, strategic bombers, precision-guided weapons, and field medicine marked significant leaps forward. Yet the use of napalm and chemical defoliants also raised painful ethical questions about the limits of modern warfare. The Vietnam War, with all its tragedy, suffering, and far-reaching consequences, remains an indelible milestone in human history. It not only reshaped the destiny of Vietnam, but also forced the world to rethink the meaning of power, peace, and humanity. Behind the gunfire, destruction, and division lies a costly lesson. No ideal is noble enough to justify the suffering of millions of innocent people. The war may have ended, but its echoes still resonate, a solemn reminder that peace is never given freely. It must be earned through courage, compassion, and the shared desire to coexist in dignity and understanding. And perhaps, from those brutal years, the world came to understand more deeply than ever the true value of one simple word: peace. Korean War. The Korean War broke out at dawn on the 25th of June, 1950, when roughly 75,000 North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The first shots fired on that small peninsula quickly ignited a blaze that spread across the world. What began as a seemingly local conflict soon became part of the Cold War, as the superpowers stepped directly into the fight. North Korea was supported by the Soviet Union and China, while South Korea received backing from the United Nations, its forces led primarily by the United States. Over 3 years, the war claimed more than 5 million lives, devastated nearly the entire peninsula, and left wounds that have never fully healed. Although an armistice was signed in July 1953, a formal peace treaty was never concluded technically. The Korean War has never officially ended. The origins of the conflict trace back to the division of Korea after World War II. When Japan surrendered, the United States and the Soviet Union divided the peninsula along the 38th parallel. Two rival governments quickly emerged: the Republic of Korea in the south, backed by the United States, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, modeled after the Soviet system. Both claimed to be the sole legitimate government of all Korea and aspired to reunify the peninsula under their own political system. In a world split by the Cold War, Korea became the testing ground for a global ideological confrontation. When North Korean troops stormed southward, they rapidly captured most of the territory, driving South Korean and U.S. forces into a small defensive perimeter around Pusan, at the peninsula's southern tip. The desperate situation led the United Nations Security Council to approve military intervention. 16 nations contributed troops, forming an international coalition under the UN flag. In September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched one of the most daring operations of the century, the Incheon Landing, enabling UN forces to retake Seoul and push the North Koreans back to the Chinese border. But as the Allied troops approached the Yalu River, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteer soldiers suddenly poured across, reversing the tide of war. The brutal winter offensives turned the peninsula into a frozen hell, where every meter of ground was paid for with thousands of lives. By mid-1951, the conflict had settled into stalemate. Both sides fought bitterly over hills and rivers in a prolonged war of attrition. After more than 2 years of grueling negotiations, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom on the 27th of July 1953, establishing a 4-kilometer-wide demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel. However, since South Korea refused to sign the document, the war technically never ended. The human and material toll was catastrophic. More than 5 million people died, including about 3 million Koreans, most of them civilians. Cities such as Seoul and Pyongyang were leveled, villages, bridges, and factories wiped out. Millions of families were torn apart, many never reunited. Occasional family reunions, marked by tears and silence, serve as painful reminders that war not only destroys land, but also tears apart the human heart. After the war, the two Koreas took starkly different paths. In the south, U.S. aid fueled rapid industrialization, and by the 1980s, South Korea had become one of Asia's most dynamic economies. In the north, Pyongyang pursued the isolationist doctrine of Juche self-reliance under a dynastic regime. Tensions have persisted for decades, as North Korea developed nuclear weapons and missile programs, triggering repeated cycles of confrontation and fragile détente. The Korean War remains a sobering reminder of how fragile peace can be in the nuclear age, and of the devastation that follows when strategic ambitions spiral out of control. For the United States, the Korean War offered major political lessons. President Harry Truman's decision to dismiss General MacArthur, who wanted to expand the war into China, reaffirmed the principle of civilian control over the military, a cornerstone of democratic governance. The conflict also reshaped U.S. foreign policy, leading Washington to strengthen global military alliances and maintain a long-term presence in Asia. In Western culture, it is often called the Forgotten War, overshadowed by the later Vietnam War. Yet, it was never truly forgotten. The acclaimed television series MASH, set in the fictional 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, brought the Korean War back into public memory. Mixing humor and tragedy, it portrayed the absurdity, exhaustion, and humanity of war. The show's finale became the most watched broadcast in U.S. television history, proof that even when people wish to forget, the memory of war endures. From a military and medical standpoint, the Korean War marked a turning point in modern battlefield medicine. For the first time, helicopters were widely used to evacuate the wounded, giving rise to the Dust-Off air rescue system. Mobile surgical hospitals were improved, and new advances in trauma care, shock treatment, preventive medicine, and combat psychiatry were developed, laying the groundwork for modern military medicine. Though more than 7 decades have passed, the Korean War remains an unhealed scar in world history. It not only shaped the destinies of two nations sharing the same bloodline, but also became one of the clearest symbols of the global ideological divide. Amid smoke and blood, it revealed a harsh but necessary truth. When ideology triumphs over humanity, peace will always be fragile. And even today, as barbed wire still stretches across the DMZ and the two Koreas stare at each other through binoculars, one question continues to echo: when will the Korean War truly end? Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was one of the most brutal and consequential conflicts in ancient Greek history. Lasting for 27 years, it pitted the two greatest powers of the Greek world against each other: Athens, with its unrivaled naval might, and the Delian League under its command, and Sparta, whose disciplined land forces dominated the Peloponnesian League. The historian Thucydides, who witnessed the war firsthand, called it the greatest war among the Greeks, as nearly every city-state in the Hellenic world was drawn into its violent web of alliances and rivalries. When the smoke cleared, Athens, the shining center of democracy and Greek culture, lay in ruins, and Sparta briefly emerged as the dominant power. Yet, this victory ushered in a period of decline that marked the beginning of the end for the classical Greek world. The roots of the conflict lay in the shifting balance of power after the Greeks defeated the Persian Empire. That triumph had propelled Athens to new heights. Backed by a formidable navy and the revenues of the Delian League, Athens gradually transformed what had been a defensive alliance into a maritime empire, collecting tribute and imposing control over its allies. Sparta, representing traditionalism, austerity, and military discipline, viewed this growing Athenian influence as a direct threat. The 30 Years' Peace of 445 BCE provided only a temporary calm. Tensions escalated when Athens imposed trade sanctions on Megara, blockaded Potidaea, and forged an alliance with Corcyra, the rival of Corinth. To Sparta, these moves were open provocations and violations of the treaty. Thucydides observed, "The truest cause of the war was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta." The spark came when Thebes, a Spartan ally, attacked Plataea, an Athenian ally, igniting a war that would last nearly 3 decades. The first phase, known as the Archidamian War, 431–421 BCE, saw Sparta ravage the Athenian countryside year after year. Following the strategy of Pericles, Athens withdrew its people behind the long walls and relied on its navy to sustain supplies through the port of Piraeus. This defensive approach initially held firm, but a devastating plague swept through the overcrowded city in 430–429 BCE, killing tens of thousands, including Pericles himself. His death left Athens without its most capable leader, and morale crumbled. The uneasy Peace of Nicias, signed in 421 BCE, brought a brief lull, but only a fragile one. The war flared up again, with the ill-fated Sicilian expedition. Urged on by the ambitious Alcibiades, Athens launched a massive naval assault on Syracuse, hoping to seize control of the island's rich resources. The campaign turned into catastrophe. Alcibiades was recalled, and in 413 BCE, the entire Athenian fleet was annihilated. Thousands of soldiers were killed or enslaved. Sparta, now financed by Persia, seized the opportunity to occupy Decilia and foment revolts among Athens's allies. In 405 BCE, under the command of Lysander, the Spartan navy crushed the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami, cutting off the city's food supply. Starved and demoralized, Athens surrendered the following year, in 404 BCE. The consequences were devastating. Athens was forced to dismantle its empire, tear down its long walls, surrender its fleet, and accept Spartan control. Sparta installed a puppet regime, the infamous 30 Tyrants, whose reign of terror lasted 8 months before democracy was restored in 403 BCE. Though Athens regained its democratic institutions, it never recovered its former glory. Its population dwindled, the economy collapsed, and the brilliance of the golden age of Greece faded into memory. Sparta's triumph, however, proved hollow. The city soon found itself exhausted, embroiled in revolts among its allies and internal strife. Within a few decades, Thebes rose to challenge Spartan dominance, only to fall in turn until Macedonia, under Philip II, and later Alexander the Great, united Greece by force. The Peloponnesian War not only destroyed Athens, but also marked the end of the era of independent Greek city-states, paving the way for the rise of imperial monarchies. The lesson Thucydides drew from the war remains timeless. The real cause of war lies not in immediate events, but in the human passions of pride, fear, and greed. The Peloponnesian War stands as a warning about the cost of internal division and the pursuit of hegemony when those who share the same language and culture turn against one another in the name of power. Its greatest legacy endures in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, times a foundational work of modern historiography that combined factual reporting with deep analysis of politics, morality, and human behavior. In literature, the tragedies of Euripides and the comedies of Aristophanes captured the pain and disillusionment of wartime Athens. Plays like Lysistrata and The Trojan Women were not only art but acts of protest and moral reflection. Militarily, the conflict spurred major innovations, advances in naval tactics, siege warfare, and the logistics of funding large-scale operations. Sparta's ultimate victory, achieved with Persian gold rather than mere military strength, demonstrated that wars are won as much by resources and alliances as by swords and spears. More than 2,400 years later, the Peloponnesian War remains a mirror reflecting the timeless nature of human ambition, showing how pride, fear, and rivalry can bring even the greatest civilizations to ruin. And perhaps that is why history continues to remember it, because, in the end, the true victor in war is not the one who conquers, but the one who survives long enough to understand its cost.